The first battle had ended almost as quickly as it began. Rusty stood in the aftermath, his blade still dripping with lizardman blood, while Odalette wiped her dagger clean with a quick flick of her wrist. Layla and Norcas, who had expertly loosed their arrows in support, exchanged a glance, both silently impressed by the seamless efficiency of their team. "Well, that went smoother than I expected," Layla said, her voice betraying a hint of relief. Norcas on the other hand was more surprised at the feat he just saw, even somewhat worried at the strength of the temporary comrade he saw. "Yet, mostly because of our friend Albert." Odalette on the other hand was excited while she crouched near the lizardman. She rummaged through its gear with her quick hands trying to find anything that could be pawned off later. "Did you see him send that lizardman flying?" "Yeah, that was surprising." Norcas, the archer, couldn't shake the growing suspicion as he observed Rusty. The sheer power Rusty displayed felt unnatural, far beyond what someone with just one class should be capable of. But despite his misgivings, Norcas hesitated to confront his new companion. Having someone that strong in the party wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Besides, this was a guild-sanctioned test, there was no immediate reason to believe Rusty was one of those notorious adventurer hunters who preyed on the weak. The thought nagged at him, but Norcas reminded himself that the guild had safeguards in place. Hidden members were stationed at various points, ensuring stronger monsters didn't stray too close. This was a controlled environment, after all, not a lawless wilderness where crimes went unnoticed. For now, he would keep his concerns to himself and hope his instincts were wrong. With a strong tank at the front, their chances of passing would increase, and this was enough for him to take a chance. "I think that Archer is wary of you, Rusty. It would be better if you toned it down when fighting monsters. You're still an E-rank monster, something even iron adventurers can't fight alone." For a moment, Rusty forgot that he was there just to pass a test. His body instinctively reacted to the monsters in front of him, everything becoming a blur as his instincts took over. Before leaving, Alexander had warned him not to use all of his skills, but it was hard to conceal the advanced passive weapon techniques he had trained in. "It's not my fault that they are this weak, the beetles were stronger." "Sure, even in the same rank, some creatures and classes will be stronger than the others. You are probably above all the other E ranks, maybe already a plus. Should I be worried?" "That archer seems to have caught on, the two others I don't think so, but at most, they will probably assume that you're just hiding your status, which isn't anything that rare." Rusty silently acknowledged Alexander's advice. His instincts as a former dungeon monster made it difficult to gauge human expectations. He was far stronger than an average E-rank adventurer, something the others seemed to notice despite their best efforts to mask it. He needed to be more cautious if he didn't want to draw suspicion, especially from Norcas. "Let's keep moving," Norcas said, his voice calm but his eyes still flickering toward Rusty from time to time. "The sooner we reach the checkpoint, the better. We don't know what else might be lurking deeper in the dungeon. Let us get back in formation and go." The team moved forward, more aware now of their surroundings. The walls seemed to close in as they navigated through the twisting passages. Every step felt heavier, the oppressive silence broken only by their footsteps and the occasional sound of shifting stone. Odalette darted ahead again, checking for traps and disarming any that she found along the way. Rusty was not far behind her, ready to block any potential threats that might target the two archers. He was now more mindful of his surroundings and party members. By adopting a more measured pace, he allowed the others to shine. Layla and Norcas worked in tandem, taking out smaller threats from a distance. Rusty's main task was to keep the monsters focused on him, while they picked them off with their arrows. Meanwhile, Odalette attacked their blind spots, sometimes using her daggers to finish them off, and other times to weaken them by slicing their leg tendons. As they rounded another corner, the party came across a larger chamber, dimly lit by the pale glowstones embedded in the walls. At the far end of the room was a stone pedestal, atop which rested a small, intricately carved box. It emitted a faint glow, almost as if trying to lure the adventurers in. The sight reminded Rusty of the treasure room on the 10th floor, causing him to pause and scan the area, wary of any hidden monsters guarding it. "That must be one of the tests, the guild's markings are on the chest," he whispered while urging everyone else to stop. "But this looks too easy. The room's too open. There's probably a trap waiting." Odalette grinned, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Leave it to me." It was a strange feeling to be in this party, even though they weren't together long. Rusty was starting to see the advantages. He wasn't very nimble nor could he detect the pressure plates hidden in this chamber, but the little halfling could. It was similar to the room he trapped adventurers in, but the placement was a lot more random here. Eventually she arrived at the chest area but held herself back from just taking it. Any problems, Odalette? Norcas called out to their thief who had stopped at the. If I lift this, it's going to trigger something, but don't worry, I've dealt with these traps before. This looks like an old model and it won't activate based on exact weight, but it will trigger if there's too little. She explained, her eyes fixed on the small chest before her. Though her head barely reached above the stone pedestal, she was still able to reach it. From her spatial satchel, she pulled out a large rock, one she could barely lift, and placed it beside the chest. Despite the added weight, the trap didn't react, allowing her to carefully lower the container. See, what did I say, easy like taking candy from an ogre. She hefted the chest over her head and started running in their direction. The sight of such a short person carrying something so large was oddly amusing to Rusty. However, his amusement was fleeting, as their victory was short-lived. With the chest in their possession, they only needed to open it and move on to the next location, but someone had other plans. Wait, who is there? Layla called out to the party while pointing towards one of the open corridors. Soon from within a dagger came flying out and it collided with the rock Odalette left on the pedestal. The dagger hit the rock with a sharp clang, sending small chips of stone flying. Odalette, caught off guard, nearly dropped the chest in surprise. Norcas was the first to react, his bow already drawn, eyes narrowing as he scanned the dim corridor where the dagger had come from. Layla quickly followed suit, an arrow notched and aimed at the dark opening. Show yours. Before Norcas could finish the sentence, the rock that had been hit rolled forward and down from the pressure plate it was on. As the rock slid off the pedestal, a deep rumbling noise echoed through the chamber. The trap had been triggered. The corridor from which the dagger came slammed shut and they found themselves trapped inside. Everyone's eyes widened in horror as a strange white mist suddenly erupted around them. It's sleeping mist de Dante. Odalette tried to warn everyone as she dropped the chest, but even she had already been affected by the gas. All of them tried covering their mouths with something to fight off the effects, but the mist was too potent. Odalette, the first to inhale the sleep-inducing gas, swayed unsteadily before collapsing to the ground. Norcas and Layla, their bows still drawn, coughed and staggered as the mist overwhelmed them. Rusty, being immune to poisons and gases, was the only one unaffected and wondered what he should do in this situation. Luckily Alexander was there to raise a good point. Be calm, Rusty, it's just sleeping mist, it won't kill them. This test was implemented by the guild, so they probably chose this route for a reason. What do you mean? There probably won't be any monsters appearing, and now that the trap was triggered, probably some guild officials are already on their way here, but is there a problem? Whoever knocked that rock off its pedestal is still out there, and they might be targeting someone here. We need to be careful. First, check Odalette's satchel. If she's a thief, she may have some special smelling salts to counteract the effect, or perhaps a potion. There was truth in Alexander's words. It would be strange for the guild to set up a trap that was too deadly for the candidates. However, that didn't mean there wasn't real danger. Rusty knew how these kinds of traps worked, and soon the sealed pathways would reopen. Whoever threw that dagger, or even monsters, could flood the chamber, quickly massacring his unconscious party. Rusty wasted no time. His target was Odalette's satchel, which wasn't much different than the one he took from the previous dungeon. He crouched beside her, his metallic fingers swiftly rummaging through her satchel. As expected, she had an assortment of tools, lockpicks, a small set of vials, and there, a small bottle with a sharp, acrid smell. Rusty couldn't really smell it due to his lack of nostrils, but could use his identification skill to confirm that these were the smelling salts Alexander was talking about. The place is clearing up. Place them against the wall and then make them smell the salts. It won't wake them up immediately, but it should work. He followed the instructions and repositioned the three against one of the walls. Then, he popped the cork from the small bottle and held it under their noses, starting with Norcas. After a moment, he noticed an adverse reaction to the smell, and his first party member finally began to wake up. However, just as Norcas was regaining consciousness, the walls that had sealed themselves began to shift and rumble, opening up to let whoever was outside in. Ugh, what? The archer felt groggy, but the sight of an ominous man wearing iron armor jolted him awake. He felt out of it but quickly remembered the incident with the sleeping mist. He could see two other people next to him, but before he could check on them he was handed a small bottle with a rather rancid smell. Use this to wake the others. Hey! At first, he wasn't sure why he had been given the item, but soon the reason became clear. Not far from them, a group of monsters began to file in. Most were the same adolescent lizardmen they had faced before, but among them were higher-ranked ones. These stood half a head taller, with more muscle and superior weaponry. Classification: Lizardman L5E. Type: Humanoid/lizard folk. Rusty left to engage the group in combat, following Alexander's instructions. It was better for his party members to provide him with ranged support rather than for him to fight them alone. He was aware that if he allowed the three to perish, he might fail the guild exam. Retaking the Iron Adventurer test would require waiting an entire month, which would make rescuing Gleam highly improbable. He didn't hesitate as the new group of lizardmen poured into the chamber. The higher-ranked ones carried better crafted spears and shields, their scales gleaming in the dim glowstone light. There were 2 of the larger ones in the back and 5 of the smaller ones in the front. They were not enemies that he would be normally afraid of, but this iron suit he was wearing and the dead mummified Albert inside just made things harder. This was a team endeavor, and Rusty was not alone. If what Alexander had told him was true, the 3 wouldn't simply run away but would actually assist him, something that intrigued him. He had faced other adventurers before, and more often than not, they did attempt to work together. With that in mind, he raised his shield and stopped holding back. The first monster he collided with was sent flying once again. As the first lizardman sailed through the air, crashing into one of its companions with a sickening thud, Rusty stood firm, his shield raised and sword at the ready. It was a strange feeling, fighting for a purpose other than leveling up or gathering resources. He could see the 2 young women slowly rousing from their slumber. He was the only thing standing between them and being mauled by the humanoid lizards. Their survival depended on him not abandoning them in this time of need. "Wake up, Layla, Odalette. We've got company. Wake up, we have to help Albert." He could hear Norcas shouting at the 2 to wake up to help, even shaking the smaller one until she responded. Layla groaned, her eyelids fluttering as she fought to focus on the approaching threat. Odalette recovered faster only to see most of her items on the ground. However, instead of asking questions she just grabbed her daggers and got ready to aid her new party member. Ha! Rusty held off the charging monsters, and even when they jabbed at him with their spears, they couldn't do more than leave scratches. Fortunately, they had no blunt weapons, just blades, arrows and other sharp objects to poke him with. He clashed with them multiple times, usually managing to block most of the damage with his shield while landing a few direct hits with his longsword. However, the 2 evolved lizards, having had enough of merely watching, finally charged at him, their sabers raised. The 2 evolved lizardmen stormed forward, their sabers gleaming under the dim glowstone light. Rusty braced himself, recognizing that these larger monsters posed a much more serious threat than their smaller counterparts. With a low growl, one of the lizardmen lunged, its saber aimed directly at Rusty's chest. He raised his shield just in time, the impact reverberating through his arm. The second lizardman, quicker than its size suggested, flanked him, slashing horizontally at his exposed side. Rusty was expecting to get hit and lowered his stance to receive the blow, but right before the saber connected, an arrow embedded itself in the monster's eye socket. The lizardman hissed out in agony as it stumbled backward, clutching at the arrow protruding from its eye. The other adventurers had gotten back on their feet and joined the fight. However, one question still lingered: who had thrown that dagger, and where were they now? The room was filled with the sounds of clashing weapons, the grunts of the lizardmen, and the rhythmic thud of arrows being loosed from bows. Rusty's shield caught another saber strike, but with the renewed support from his companions, the tide of the battle shifted. Norcas was already in his element, taking well-aimed shots from the back, while Layla, now fully awake, fired her own arrows in rapid succession. Odalette darted between the skirmishes, a blur of motion as her daggers found weak spots in the monster's legs. Rusty's iron body bore several nicks and scratches from the battle, but it was holding up. The thick cloth lining beneath the metal protected his mummified body from being exposed to his new companions. The group of 7 lizardmen had grown as reinforcements charged through the corridors, but now their numbers were dwindling, and victory was near. However, even as victory drew near, Rusty's thoughts lingered on the dagger that had struck the rock. He knew no dungeon monster would deliberately target a trap with such precision, which meant it had to be another adventurer. Someone in these tunnels wanted to harm them, and he couldn't understand why. Though his current identity was Rusty, he was now Albert, and it was possible that someone was still after him, just like the 3 thugs who had tried to extort him. Yet, he couldn't rule out the possibility that one of his companions might be the true target. The last of the lizardmen fell to the floor with a final, guttural hiss as Rusty cleaved through its scaled chest. Around him, the others were regaining their composure. Norcas, breathing heavily, wiped sweat from his brow while Layla lowered her bow, her eyes scanning the room warily. Odalet finished off one of the wounded lizardmen with a precise strike, then stepped back, taking a moment to catch her breath. That was closer than I'd like. Norcas muttered, though his voice held a note of appreciation as he glanced at Rusty. He had to admit, Rusty had kept them alive, holding the line almost single-handedly until they could regroup. Yet, we almost didn't make it. If it weren't for Mr. Albert, we would have never made it. Layla added, still eyeing the room and specifically the pedestal on which the chest had previously stood. It seemed like she wanted to say something, but before she could, the smaller halfling girl yelled out cheerfully. We did it! Odalet exclaimed, twirling one of her daggers in the air before sheathing it with a flourish. Her grin was infectious, despite the tense situation they had just been through. That's what I'm talking about. Perfect teamwork, those stupid lizards had it coming. Now what's in the chest? Rusty wiped the lizard's blood from his sword and gave a silent nod, though his thoughts were still focused on the unknown threat. Odalet on the other hand launched herself at the chest they had taken and quickly picked the simple lock on it. However, her cheerful expression was replaced with disappointment after she took out a badge with the guild's mark on it. Drat! Was this just part of the test? Yes, that's one of the badges we need to retrieve to complete the exam. There should be another one at the last location. Rusty glanced at a badge that appeared to be made of wood. The sight of it sparked a memory, and without hesitation, he leaned down toward one of the fallen lizardmen. With a single hand, he effortlessly flipped the creature over, startling the other adventurers. Before anyone could question his actions, he grabbed something attached to the monster's back. Is this it? Ah, yes, that looks like the other one, but why would it be here and on that monster? His three party members stared in confusion at the second badge now in Rusty's hand. With both badges in their possession, they no longer needed to continue deeper into the dungeon, but the discovery raised more questions. I see, so that's what happened. Did you figure something out? Rusty heard Alexander's voice quickly after giving the badge away and he responded. I have a theory. Your group was likely meant to reach the final area, facing fewer monsters. The badge was attached to one of them, waiting for you to find it. But the fact that it's here means whoever threw that dagger probably lured the monsters from that area to us. And I doubt they were working for the guild. What was their goal? Either they didn't want your group to succeed in the exam or they were targeting someone specifically. Rusty glanced at the three companions he barely knew. Like Albert, they could have found themselves entangled with the wrong people or crossed paths with dangerous thugs. There was much he didn't understand about their culture or motives. Being a monster wasn't easy as he was not aware of the nuances of this world. He only knew that adventurers, and the various races, could kill for almost anything, a grudge, resources, or even a stray look, things he still struggled to comprehend. Before Rusty could contemplate Alexander's words, some footsteps echoed out of one of the now opened corridors. The other party members heard them as well and quickly readied their weapons again. He was now used to working in this small group and moved forward to intercept whoever was going to come out of that corridor. The footsteps didn't belong to a lizardman and were clearly more human in nature. Rusty, it could be the culprit, get ready. Alexander had advised him to be cautious, and Rusty took the warning to heart. He was well aware that some adventurers, especially those of silver rank, were stronger than him. Even with the entire group fighting together, victory against one of them would be uncertain. His true body had a durability that could contend with a silver rank, but revealing that would mean blowing his cover. If the task became too difficult, fleeing would be the wisest option. Yet, for some reason, the thought of abandoning these three felt wrong, even if it meant saving his own life. It was as if he was slowly beginning to think like an adventurer, something he wasn't sure how to feel about. It didn't make sense, as if they discovered his true nature, they'd likely turn their swords on him without hesitation. The sound of footsteps grew louder as the group braced themselves, weapons at the ready. Rusty stepped forward, his shield raised to intercept any immediate threat. The dim light from the glowstones cast long shadows across the chamber, heightening the tension. Alexander's warning echoed in his mind, and Rusty gripped his sword tighter, preparing for the worst. Suddenly, from the far corridor, a figure emerged, a man, tall and lean, dressed in dark leather armor. His face was unobscured, and the moment his other party members saw him, they started lowering their weapons. The man was someone they knew, as he was part of the guild staff. He was quick to stop and raised his hands at the pointed bows and swords in his direction. Calm down, I'm from the guild. Didn't mean to spook you lot. Guild sent me to check on things when the mist trap went off. Seemed like you handled it well, but, what's with those all monsters? The guild official began surveying the area and immediately sensed that something was wrong. There were far too many monster corpses, far more than the guild had anticipated. The test site was under the guild's supervision to some extent, with workers stationed at various points to keep stronger monsters away. Clearly, something had gone awry, and the official wasted no time in asking questions. What happened here? The guild staffer asked, his voice filled with concern as his eyes darted between the fallen lizardmen and the adventurers. Norcas, who had taken on the role of party leader, was the first to respond. You might not believe us, but someone set off the sleeping mist trap that we disabled. They set it off? What do you mean? Tell me everything that happened and leave nothing out. The man was taken aback by the claim but quickly composed himself and asked for more details. Rusty listened quietly, relieved that he wasn't the one who had to explain. Norcas then recounted what had happened and started off with how they arrived in the room with the chest. He then recounted how someone threw a dagger into the chamber and then also probably lured the monsters to finish them off. The guild official raised an eyebrow, his expression somewhat skeptical of their tale. So you're telling me that someone triggered the trap in an attempt to kill you? Then somehow lured in the monsters here to kill you? Yes. Unless you can prove it somehow. The man wasn't convinced, and even when Odalette brought out the dagger that collided with her rock to present as evidence, the man just shook his head. I see the dagger, but this alone doesn't prove someone deliberately triggered the trap to harm you. It could have been a stray shot, or someone else attempting the test, perhaps even a stray monster. He shrugged, almost dismissing their claim outright. Norcas tightened his grip on his bow, clearly frustrated. You're seriously going to dismiss this? Monsters don't just target rocks on a pressure plate trap that spawns sleeping mist. Rusty didn't say anything as his party members started arguing with the guild member. Instead, he listened to Alexander, who quickly told him to do something instead. Rusty, this won't lead anywhere. It would be better if you all left now before something else happens. He agreed with his guide that the task was to obtain the 2 badges in order to complete the examination. Now that they had both badges, it no longer mattered who had thrown the dagger. It was too dangerous to stay here with unknown enemies lurking about. After listening to Alexander's guidance on what to say, Rusty stepped forward toward the guild official and began to speak. Excuse me, but we both have badges, right? Rusty said, his voice sounding calm yet firm. Yes. The other party members stopped talking and the guild official responded. The task is then complete. If we return, we will have passed the test, yes? He asked again, and the man paused for a moment before nodding. Sure. You just need to give those badges to Garen as proof. After he received the answer, he turned to his 3 party members who also needed to return with him for this to be successful. Even if he took both badges and returned by himself, if everyone else died, he wouldn't be given the iron rank card. Then shouldn't we leave? You might be right, Albert. Staying here longer puts us all in danger. It would be better to let the guild handle the rest. Norcas, their temporary leader, nodded in agreement. It was safer to retreat now when they had the chance. The man before them could be a hidden enemy, so his decision to leave found no protests. Mr. Albert makes a good point. Let's just leave. We have completed the task laid out by the guild. Layla agreed with Rusty, and Odalette didn't seem to care one way or another. The only thing she was interested in was getting more money, something Rusty also could get behind. If you all say so? Then let's just go, but perhaps first, we should take all of the loot. The room was littered with monster remains, some of which could be sold to the guild for a decent amount of coins. The guild official watched as they gathered the most valuable parts. He took his time examining their claim, inspecting the chamber thoroughly before eventually disappearing down the corridor from which the dagger had been thrown. Rusty and his party decided to retreat for the time being. Having already successfully completed their iron rank test, they preferred not to tempt fate any further. That was smart, Albert. For all we know, that guild member could be with the person that tried to mess with us. As they were walking back, Norcas complimented Rusty on his quick thinking. Layla seemed shocked by this statement, while Odalette didn't respond as she was busy counting the amount of money they would receive for the harvested monster parts. They made their way back through the winding corridors of the dungeon. The tension from the recent battle began to dissipate, though an undercurrent of unease remained. Do you think we can really trust that guild official? What if he's somehow involved in this? We don't know who we're dealing with. Their temporary leader wasn't amused by the incident in the dungeon, but Odalet's more cynical words brought him back to reality. Can we do anything about it if he is involved? You're probably right, if the guild is involved in this, they could target us if we make too much noise about the issue. Rusty listened from the sidelines, trying to understand the adventurers he wasn't very familiar with. It seemed that power was still paramount in their society, much like in the world of monsters. Even if they had evidence, confronting a more powerful entity could be unwise and might just get them killed. It was probably better to remain silent and hope that whoever was responsible wouldn't seek further trouble with them. Strength is all that matters. He mumbled to himself, but his thoughts were interrupted by his guide, Alexander. Rusty had chosen to summon only him as his sole helper, as having both out at once would create too much chaos during battles. Is it the only thing that matters? Is it not? Do you think you would have done better without the help from those 3 kids? Or were they actually helpful? Rusty wasn't sure, as he hadn't been allowed to use his true form in that battle. However, that didn't mean Alexander was wrong. Rusty lacked skills for opening locks and detecting traps. Additionally, having ranged support was a big help while fighting monsters. The arrows fired by the 2 adventurers prevented him from getting scratched on several occasions. But weren't you betrayed by your party before? Well, that's true, but... Alexander didn't know how to respond, as this was undeniably true. Having party members could be highly advantageous, but also risky. His guide had been betrayed by companions in the past, yet for some reason, he still clung to the belief that being in a party was ultimately a net positive. Well, accidents can happen, but there is no replacement for a good party. Why don't we focus on getting out of this dungeon first? If you say so. The group pressed on, making their way back through the winding corridors of the maze dungeon. The thrill of battle had faded, leaving behind a heavy, unsettling silence. All of them were eager for this strange day to finally end. Fortunately, without any further incidents, they reached the dungeon's exit, where more guild members awaited their return. None appeared perturbed, and it was clear that word of the strange attempt on their lives had yet to reach them. Finally we're out, and it didn't even take that long. You're right, Miss Odalet. Layla smiled at the smaller halfling girl as they ventured outside the dungeon. Guild officials were already waiting for them, and most of the other parties that had finished their test were long gone. Odalet raised an eyebrow at how Layla had addressed her and quickly corrected her. Miss? Come on, we went through that whole dungeon together. Just call me Odalet. Layla chuckled softly and nodded. All right, if you insist. Odalet it is. Their camaraderie had grown naturally after the ordeal they'd shared. Rusty watched quietly as the 2 talked, unsure of what was unfolding before him. It seemed similar to his own relationship with Gleam, who was still captured by these strange beings made of flesh. As they neared Garen, the silver rank adventurer, the party's archer moved to Rusty's side with a question. Albert, can I ask you something? Yes. How were you able to resist the sleeping mist when we were in there? Rusty had anticipated this moment, as Alexander had already instructed him on how to respond. This helmet is special as it can resist most airborne toxins, like the sleeping mist. I see, a special helmet. Though Rusty was still a monster pretending to be human, he needed to conceal his true identity. Most adventurers without special abilities or items would be vulnerable to poisons, paralysis, or sleep. Norcas eyed Rusty's helmet suspiciously, squinting slightly. Rusty sensed that this wasn't a good sign, but before he could react, the silver-ranked guild official approached them. I see you're the last team to return in one piece. Do you have the badges? Garen's voice sounded tired, as if he didn't care much for the well-being of their party and he only wanted proof of their completed task. Norcas, their temporary leader, nodded and handed over the 2 badges. Good, looks like you've completed the task. Mark it down. Garen turned to another guild worker holding a clipboard, who quickly took note. It seemed that was all the confirmation needed, and before Rusty or anyone else could ask questions, Garen spoke again. You can come get your new cards tomorrow. That's all for the test, you can return to the city. The guild official's quick dismissal hung in the air as the group exchanged glances. After all they had been through, facing near death, unknown threats, and even possible betrayal, this ending felt anticlimactic. Their temporary leader looked like he wanted to ask something but ultimately decided against it. Thank you, sir. Norcas replied, lowering his head slightly. Garen turned away to address the other guild members, who seemed eager to leave. Meanwhile, their group gathered for one last conversation before parting ways. I wonder if everyone made it out alive. Were we the only ones who had trouble with outside interference? Norcas asked, his frustration evident. He didn't like that he had nearly lost his life, not to monsters, but to someone else's meddling. He wasn't sure if the attack had been aimed at him or at someone else in their temporary party, but without investigating further, they couldn't be sure. Maybe we should ask the guild about it. Layla suggested while the halfling girl shook her head in disapproval. Do you really think they'll tell us anything? They could be in on it. I say we lay low for a few weeks. With the monster parts we gathered, we can easily live well for a month, feasting on all sorts of delicious food. Layla nodded thoughtfully, while Rusty remained silent. He wasn't truly paying attention to the conversation. These issues didn't concern him anymore. In his mind, his only goal was to earn more money and rescue Gleam. After that, his adventuring days would probably be over. He hadn't yet thought about what he would do afterward, but for now, he was focused on one thing at a time. Can I leave now? Rusty asked Alexander for advice, unsure of what to do. The test was apparently over, but he still had to wait until the next day to receive his new iron card. Only then would he be able to officially enter the dungeon. It'd be better if you stayed with them for now. We still need to divide the earnings from the monster parts between the four of you. Divide them. Even when I killed most of the monsters. Alexander chuckled. That's how parties work. They might give you a bigger cut since you did most of the work, but first, you need to sell the parts and that requires you to return to the guild. Just tag along with them for now, they will probably do that first. Just as Alexander finished his sentence, the temporary party leader brought up the issue. How about we head back to the guild and sell those monster parts first? Oh, good idea, leader. Odalet chimed in, which surprised their temporary leader. Leader. Norcas responded in a flustered tone at Odalet's casual title for him. Layla on the other hand just chuckled while Rusty remained silent. The three quickly realized their companion, Albert, was the strong, silent type and didn't push him for conversation. That didn't stop them from mentioning him occasionally, to which he responded with as few words as possible. Eventually, the group arrived at the guild building where they were greeted by loud shouting coming from inside. Doesn't it feel more rowdy than usual? Layla inquired as their group moved in through the guild entrance. Inside they could see a small group of people arguing with the guild receptionist wearing large glasses. The woman seemed in distress but she was being protected by some adventurers as well. There is something not right about that test of yours. How did my brother get injured this bad? Please sir, calm down, accidents happen, even during the rank-up tests. Rusty and the others paused as they entered the guild hall, taking in the scene of commotion before them. An armor-wearing middle-aged man with a deep scowl was standing at the counter, pointing accusingly at the guild receptionist. His voice carried across the hall as he gestured toward the limp form of another man being held up by a healer nearby. Blood-soaked bandages were wrapped around his left arm, that had been severed near his forearm. You call this an accident? He went in for a simple rank-up test, and now he's missing an arm. You're telling me that's normal? The receptionist, clearly flustered, tried to respond calmly. Sir, I understand your frustration, but the guild cannot guarantee complete safety in dungeons, even during tests. All participants are made aware of the risks. My brother didn't sign up to get ambushed by monsters that shouldn't even be in that part of the dungeon. The man cut her off, fury etched on his face and his group continued to listen. So it wasn't us that were the only us, maybe that's why Garen looked so tired. Norcas pondered while the others just nodded. They continued to listen to the conversation but eventually even the guild master appeared to take care of the issue. Once the burly man was there, the other adventurers went silent. It was clear to Rusty that the leader of the guild was powerful and without many more words being spoken, the group that had been complaining retreated. It might be best to just get our coins and leave. I don't like what's happening here, the guild might be hiding something. The others nodded in agreement and headed to the guild's trading counter to exchange the monster parts they had collected. Despite the unsettling events, the area remained bustling with activity. Unlike the main guild area, this section had counters protected by reinforced metal bars to ensure the safety of the guild workers inside. Rusty noticed that when it came to money, these adventurers were serious. This was where they received mission rewards or exchanged materials for cash. The exchange process here was specialized and more efficient than asking around at the main guild counters. There were 3 booths, and after waiting for about 10 minutes, it was their turn to approach one. Good evening. Are you here to turn in a mission contract, sell monster parts, or perhaps some equipment? The guild bought a wide range of items from adventurers, including weapons and armor found within dungeons, though the deals were usually less favorable than going directly to a blacksmith. It was a convenient way to offload unused items quickly, even if it meant accepting a 5 to 10% lower price. Most adventurers preferred the speed and ease of this process over spending half the day haggling with merchants. We want to sell lizardman parts. Of course, please place the items on the special holding tray there. Rusty wasn't familiar with this process and continued to watch as a large shelf emerged from under the counter. It resembled a sizable box, slightly over 1 meter wide and with a similar depth. Using his mana sense, Rusty quickly realized that this was a magical item, much like the spatial satchel he had discovered in the dungeon. His suspicions were soon confirmed. His party members began retrieving the monster parts they had collected, distributing them among themselves. Even Rusty had some lizardman tongues and claws stored in his bag. One by one, they placed the parts into the box, which seemed to have no bottom as the items vanished into it. Ugh, it stinks. Odelette commented as they finally deposited all the bloodied monster parts. They hadn't had time to properly dislodge them, so instead of just taking the claws, they had cut off the lizardman's limbs near their hands and feet. This didn't seem to bother the clerk behind the counter, who remained unfazed for some reason. Rusty could only attribute this to the magical barrier he could sense, thanks to his mana sense. Once all the monster parts were deposited into the magical holding tray, the guild clerk gestured for a brief pause. She tapped a glowing rune embedded in her desk, causing a soft hum to fill the air. It took a few minutes, but eventually, a scroll emerged from a slot beside her. It detailed the quantity of materials submitted along with other relevant information. Let's see, this will amount to 1 gold coin and 4 silver coins. Not even 2 gold coins? Are you sure you got the right amount? Odelette frowned after hearing the meager amount that they were getting. They still had to split the money between 4 people, which would leave her with not that much. Most of the parts are damaged and will require our staff to process them again. If they were in better condition I could offer you a higher price, but in their current state, this is the best we can offer. The clerk explained politely, her voice flat and unyielding. Odelette sighed in frustration but didn't press further. They had little choice in the matter if they wanted to offload the monster parts quickly. It was possible to receive more if they picked out the claws and other parts that were profitable, but none of them had the time or skills. To Rusty, this was quite an annoyance. His current quest was to earn more money, and gaining just a few silver coins wouldn't help him much. This might be more difficult than I expected. What monsters bring in the most gold? While his party members were busy talking to the guild clerk, Rusty took a moment to look around. The answer to his question was right in front of his metallic visor. A nearby notice board held all the information he needed, divided into several sections that listed the most desirable items and their prices. The names of the monsters and items didn't tell him much, but fortunately, his guide was with him. Alexander, can you remember those before we leave? It might be better to ask a burden instead. I don't think I can take all of this in with just a few glances. Rusty felt a bit disappointed but reminded himself that both his guides had their strengths and weaknesses. A burden was knowledgeable in the arcane arts and often lingered in the Soul Forge library, likely possessing a far better memory than Alexander. He could probably absorb information much quicker. Alexander, on the other hand, had been a hero and a warrior, which meant he would probably be better at guiding him towards those monsters or telling him how he should act like a human. As the group finished their exchange, Rusty silently mulled over the disappointing earnings. 1 gold coin and 4 silver pieces barely made a dent in his goal to amass enough money to free Gleam. He needed a plan that went beyond scraping by on lizardman parts. With the list in front of him, he had a new strategy. First thing in the morning, he'd get his card replaced and have a burden memorize all the necessary information. Then, it would finally be time to scour the iron-ranked maze. This was his best chance to make real progress. Well then, how about we give Albert 5 silver coins and each of us keeps 3 each? Once they had gotten all the money, the party moved over to one of the free guild tables. There Norcus surprisingly presented a plan of giving Rusty most of the money, something he didn't expect. He thought that all of these adventurers were far too greedy to share their resources. Think that's fair? Layla nodded with confirmation and Odelette did the same. Yeah, we wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for him, he also took care of most of the lizardmen. Rusty just nodded, earning half a gold coin was still good enough for his efforts. Now that he had his money and had added it to the coins he'd earned from selling metals, it was time to leave. However, before he could stand up, the others started talking again. Now then, on to other things. Can I make a proposition? Their temporary leader spoke up, and everyone turned to listen. I think we did well in the dungeon. What if we formed an official party? Odalet chimed in, clearly liking the idea. Oh, that's not a bad idea. We just need one more fighter at the front to help Albert, and we'll take over that dungeon in no time. Sorry, but I already have other plans. Layla said, declining before Rusty could give his own thoughts. That's a shame, but we could still form a party with the three of us, the leader suggested. Ah, sorry, but I also have other plans. Rusty said, mirroring Layla's response before Norcas could continue. He had realized that working with others had its benefits, but also its downsides. While the group provided safety, it meant fewer experience points for him and the need to share resources and money. This was for the best. Norcas blinked in surprise at Rusty's refusal. He had been so sure that everyone would be on board. A flash of disappointment crossed his face, but he quickly recovered and smiled. I see. Well, if you ever change your mind, don't be a stranger. Odalet pouted, which made Layla feel a bit guilty about the situation. Everyone had their own reasons for becoming adventurers and their own ways of doing things. With that, the temporary party was officially dissolved, and their paths would now diverge. However, perhaps in the future, their journeys would cross once again. Finally. What took you so long? Were you really having more fun with that idiot hero than with your own Demon King? He was just better suited to help me interact with the adventurers. Now that the test is over, I don't need him as much. Rusty replied to a burden, whom he had finally summoned after returning to his empty inn room. The party had already disbanded, leaving him alone once more. A burden, the Demon King bowed to Rusty, scoffed at the response, his pride clearly wounded by the idea of being less useful than Alexander, the hero. The black orb of light that represented the Demon King hovered above Rusty's head, as though trying to assert its superiority as a companion. Despite his smugness, a burden knew he couldn't refuse an order from his master. Initially, Rusty had wanted both of them to be summoned at the same time as three heads, after all, seemed better than one or two. But the two bickered continuously, like an old married couple, and only caused more problems. It was easier to summon them one at a time. Now that Rusty was becoming more accustomed to the adventurer's life, it was fine to let Alexander rest for a while. Next time, wouldn't it be better to just take all the money for yourself? They would have let you pass the test if you gave them the badges, wouldn't they? I doubt it. Working as a team was part of the test. It was better not to push my luck. HOH. Rusty responded, aware that a burden wasn't being completely honest. He had already figured out that both of his guides had their own agendas. The Demon King often urged him to kill, betray, and plunder, strategies that could lead to faster progress, but with much higher risks. Alexander, on the other hand, advocated for teamwork, discipline, and a slow but steady progress. The hero also had a soft spot for humans, encouraging Rusty to spare them, even when doing so could hinder his quest to save Gleam. If you continue down this path, you'll just be crawling along at a snail's pace. If you wish to save your friend, wouldn't it be better to use everything at your disposal? What do you mean? A burden floated closer as if trying to whisper into Rusty's ear. You've already encountered adventurers, seen how they operate. Even during the test, you saw them take treasure and monster parts, didn't you? Yes, that's right. What are you getting at? Why don't you just steal everything from them? Here's the plan. First, we buy a detailed map of that maze. I bet they've got one that marks all the best spots. Best spots for what? For an ambush, of course, my dear Rusty. An ambush? You want me to kill them? Rusty wasn't sure how to feel about this suggestion. The adventurers were technically his enemies, but at the same time, they could become allies. As long as he maintained his identity as Albert, they'd treat him as one of their own and even offer help. Well, if you want to be a goody two-shoes like that stick in the mud Alexander, you don't have to kill them. Just knock them out if you prefer. Once they're out of the way, we grab their spatial bags and take all their loot. How's that sound? A burden finally laid out the plan, and Rusty wasn't completely opposed to it. After observing how things worked at the guild, he knew he could sell the extra monster parts without much trouble. That doesn't sound too bad. They'll probably have some coins on them too. If I leave them alive, Alexander won't have anything to complain about. Exactly. You could even use a place like that chamber with the sleeping mist. Once they're asleep, you just grab their stuff and disappear. Rusty mulled over Aberdan's plan, recognizing its advantages. It wasn't much different from what he'd done in the old dungeon, luring unsuspecting adventurers into traps and killing them for experience points wasn't anything new. This wouldn't be any different, and adventurers were practically walking loot boxes, just waiting to be opened. However, he knew Alexander would likely complain if the killings continued, and there was also the issue with the guild. If adventurers kept dying, the guild would eventually send an even stronger party to hunt him down, which was exactly what he wanted to avoid. It was smarter to play it safe and leave them alive for now, at least until the situation called for more drastic measures. I'll think about it, but first we'll go to the guild and look through that board. Will you be able to remember the monster names and prices? For my superior intellect, something like that is child's play. Good. Rusty nodded and waited patiently, still bound by the rules of this place. His body, incapable of sleep, felt restless as he remained confined to the small room, with little to do besides listening to his guides bicker. At the crack of dawn, he gathered his belongings and headed back to the guild. Today, he had 3 tasks: first, to retrieve his iron card, then, to study the board for the most profitable monsters, and finally, to head into the dungeon and begin his exploration. Once inside, he had no intention of leaving for a while. This would likely be the last time he returned to the guild for at least a week. The auction day had not been announced just yet, but he probably didn't have much longer than 2 weeks to get a sizable amount of money. Even if he couldn't come up with the required funds in time, he had no intention of giving up. If it came down to it, he would bloody his armor again without hesitation. As Rusty entered the guild, he noticed it was quieter than usual. The usual bustle was missing, and it seemed that none of the other participants from the rank-up trial had arrived yet. Alexander had mentioned something about adventurers celebrating with drinking and partying after accomplishing something noteworthy. Rusty wasn't fully familiar with the customs yet, but he did notice a few adventurers passed out drunk in the corners, evidence of last night's festivities. He approached the guild receptionist, who, to his surprise, was the same one who was arguing with some adventurers yesterday. "Ah, what can I do for you, sir?" The receptionist stifled a yawn, covering her mouth with one hand. "I'm here to collect my Iron Adventurer card," Rusty replied, keeping his voice steady and low, trying to act as natural as possible. The receptionist blinked a few times, clearly still groggy from the previous night's events. She quickly straightened up and began sifting through paperwork on her desk. "Of course. Could I have your old adventurer card?" "Here." Rusty had his card ready and handed it over. The woman took it and grabbed a pre-prepared list from the side. She scanned through the names, eventually confirming that Albert the Adventurer was on the list. Then, she reached for a stack of new cards. The stack was sizable, though Rusty noted it seemed smaller than the number of people who had participated in the trial. She flipped through the cards, stopping halfway to pull out Rusty's new one. His old card had a copper tint, but this one gleamed with iron. The back bore the Adventurers Guild insignia, while the front displayed his name, rank, and the details of where and when the card was issued. Rusty accepted the card, glancing briefly at the rank now etched into the metal. His mind was already wandering as the significance of this upgrade hit him. With this, he could finally return to his main mission. "Remember, if you lose this card, we can remake it, but there will be a fee," the woman continued, but Rusty had already mentally checked out. He turned on his metallic heel, cutting her off mid-sentence. He was tired of playing along with these adventurers, tired of pretending to care about their customs. The mummified body inside the armor might have felt lighter, but it was still uncomfortable. Once he was back in the dungeon, he could finally enjoy his freedom again. "Thank you, and goodbye." "Ah. Have a nice day, sir," the receptionist muttered, watching as he walked away. She placed his old card aside and resumed her work, her curiosity lingering on the odd adventurer for just a moment longer. She watched as Rusty walked toward the exit, only to stop suddenly and turn around with urgency. His pace quickened as he charged back toward her, catching her off guard. Was there something more?" she asked, her glasses almost falling off her nose as she flinched. "Yes. Do you happen to have maps for the Iron Ranked dungeon?" "For the Dungeon of the Maze?" "Absolutely." We have the newest and most updated maps with all the pointers an iron adventurer would ever need. She quickly replied with enthusiasm like an experienced merchant. Rusty almost forgot the most crucial part of his preparation, the map. He needed it, and not only it as a burden had to memorize the creatures and treasures listed on the guild board. The map of the maze dungeon had 3 levels, each requiring its own corresponding map. The first level cost 1 silver coin, but the second and third were pricier. Still, Rusty knew this was a necessary investment. Going in blind was too risky. Without something to help him orient himself, the maze would live up to its name, and he could easily become lost in its winding corridors. He fished out 1 silver coin from his satchel and deposited it down on the counter. The woman smiled at him and the trade had been made. Will this be all, or would you perhaps be interested in other maps? Or perhaps some supplies? No, this is enough. Rusty retreated once again, this time heading toward the side room where he had received his coins the day before. The room was mostly empty now, though a few adventurers were still turning in items for profit. Without engaging anyone, Rusty quietly approached the board displaying various numbers and information on monsters and rewards. A burden, hidden inside Rusty's armor, floated near his visor and began scanning the board. As ordered, he quickly processed the information. Rusty barely had to wait as a burden's ability to memorize things was almost instant. With the essential data now stored in a burden's mind, Rusty felt more confident about his upcoming journey into the dungeon. He was ready to head back into the depths and truly explore it for profit. The main mission board at the guild displayed a variety of requests from different people. From what he understood, if he wanted to accept a quest, he would need to take the request form from the board and hand it to the receptionist. Many of the missions involved leaving the city to act as a bodyguard or some type of guard in other towns. However, the ones that interested him most were the requests for monster materials. These missions had a time limit and could potentially earn him more money, though they didn't always guarantee a reward. Some of the missions couldn't be reserved in advance. The first person to return with the required items would receive the reward. It was a risky move to focus on certain requests, but thanks to a burden's memorization skills, he could later decide on the most worthwhile ones. Once he was done looking through all of the information, it was finally time to leave. His pace increased, the crowds of people still not formed, which allowed him to arrive at the exit to the city quite fast. The journey to the dungeon was uneventful, with a few adventurers trailing behind while others returned from their own missions. The scenery grew familiar, and after flashing his new iron rank card to the guards, he continued inside. It feels similar, yet somehow different. Rusty had returned to the dungeon, unnoticed by the other adventurers who paid little attention to the lone iron rank fighter. The walls were smooth as before, offering no cover from view. If he intended to ambush other adventurers, it certainly wouldn't be in one of these corridors, where there was nothing to hide behind. Can you really do it? Of course, I am the Demon Lord. So, where should I go next? That depends. What are you looking for, my dear Rusty? Rare monsters? Perhaps booby-trapped rooms to lead those pesky adventurers in? Or maybe we should just skip to the first area boss. Rusty held onto the map while letting a burden absorb the details. Unfortunately, he wasn't the fastest reader, but he could at least understand the symbols. This dungeon was different from the one he was used to. One major difference was that every level was a maze, and another was that each one was guarded by a boss monster, similar to the one he had faced on the 10th floor. Alexander mentioned that these bosses are regularly killed by adventurers, so for now, let's just focus on finding some regular monsters to hunt, something above those lizardmen, true ranks. I see you're being daring today, Rusty. If I'm correct, and I am always correct, then there should be some orcs around the Wester area. They should a good way to get that metal heart pumping. But I don't have a heart. It's just a way of speaking, my dear Rusty, try to keep up. He didn't appreciate the mocking tone, but lacking human sensitivities, so he wasn't too bothered by it. Soon, Rusty was navigating the dungeon corridors, guided by a burden, who directed him at every turn. It was as if he had a natural radar, always aware of his position without the need to constantly check the map. The plan was in motion, and Rusty couldn't wait to shed his current disguise. As soon as he entered the dungeon, he had used the loadout feature to remove Albert's body from within his armor, instantly feeling much lighter. However, he couldn't yet return to his original monster form. Too many adventurers were still roaming the tunnels, a problem that was quickly becoming a headache. He encountered a few lone lizardmen along the way and also a variant of some from his old dungeon. Some skeletons blocked his way, their bones obsidian in color and their movements much quicker than the ones he was familiar with. Classification: Obsidian Skeleton Soldier L3E. Type: Undead. Description: An evolved version of a skeleton monster, their black bones are much more resistant to shattering when compared to their lesser evolved forms. The description had been accurate, but just like before, with the help of his elemental discharge skill, the creatures quickly turned to dust. Unfortunately, there weren't many of them here, certainly not enough to farm experience points and grow stronger. Their bones or the powder they turned into weren't highly valued, but even a few copper coins were worth taking, so he collected everything he could. Don't worry, Gleam, I'll save you one way or another. With his path laid out before him, he ventured deeper into the illuminated corridors. Although the adventurers posed a threat to his life, soon enough he would receive a very helpful skill that would allow him to resume his old tactics. Several obsidian skeletons charged at a large person wearing iron armor in a well-lit corridor. His movements were swift as he sidestepped the first skeleton's swing, bringing his mace down on its exposed spine. The obsidian bones cracked but didn't shatter immediately. The sword hummed with a faint glow, a trace of light elemental energy coursing through it. With a quick twist, it was swung upwards, now cutting through the black bones like butter. The two skeletons advanced, their jagged iron weapons raised in unison. Their opponent didn't retreat, instead, as one of the bladed weapons swung down, he caught it with his metal gauntlet. His sword thrust forward, piercing the monster's skull in a single, decisive blow. The third monster didn't fare too well, soon having his skull exploded by one strong radiant punch. Not bad, Rusty. Your control over the light has gotten better, but remember, not all monsters are weak to it. The light won't work on the orcs nor on the lizardmen, the darkness on the other hand. Rusty looked down at the bones on the ground. He had already figured out that it was more lucrative to not turn these bones into dust. The purifying energies of his light skill would cleanse the evil undead energies from the bones, rendering them worthless to anyone who was trying to use them for things like alchemy or crafting. At least that was what Aberdan claimed as he was explaining how his light worked on the monsters here. Once he defeated these three, his system gave him a notification of him gaining a new level and also a new skill. Name: Rusty. Classification: Twilight Iron Armor EL3. Type: Magical/Inorganic. Hit points HP: 242/242. Magic points MP: 202/202. Special points SP: 50/50ths. Strength: 89E. Agility: 65E. Dexterity: 64E. Constitution: 92E. Intelligence: 70E. Wisdom: 72E. Willpower: 71E. Durability: D. Detect Life L1. Passive skill. When focusing, it becomes possible to detect living creatures within a certain radius. The range and clarity improve with each level. Rusty glanced at the new skill notification, his gauntlet hand resting on the hilt of his sword. The skill, Detect Life, didn't seem particularly useful for navigating the maze-like dungeon, but it could prove helpful for his future plans. Almost instantly, Aberdan, who had a direct view of Rusty's status screen, chimed in. This is quite useful, Rusty. It might be just what we needed for our plan to work. Oh? How so? Rusty asked, his curiosity piqued. Why don't you try activating it first and see? Nodding, Rusty activated the skill while picking up the shattered black bones scattered around him. As soon as he did, a strange sensation washed over him. He could sense something behind one of the walls, a presence, moving around and emitting a faint pulse. From one of the nearby corridors, he detected 3 more of those pulses approaching, causing him to flinch. Even before their footsteps reached his ears, the skill gave him a clear picture of the approaching group of adventurers. Quickly, he activated one of his preset loadouts. To fight the skeletons, he had swapped his usual gauntlets for his Twilight variant. The iron suit he was required to wear as an adventurer wasn't his best. It couldn't harness his elemental skill either, but switching out his gauntlets was a temporary fix and much easier to explain to anyone he might encounter. Most, if not all, adventurers likely wouldn't notice that the gauntlets belonged to a living armor. Even if they did, they'd likely assume he was just an adventurer wearing monster gauntlets, not suspecting that he was a monster himself. Ah, a lone adventurer. From around the corner, 3 figures emerged, 2 men clad in heavy armor and an archer dressed in lighter leather gear. Rusty studied them for a moment, recognizing their setup immediately. Now that he was familiar with how adventurers typically operated, he knew this wasn't an ideal party composition. They only had an archer to scout for traps and hidden threats, while the other 2 were simple frontline fighters. There was no mage for support, no healer, and no proper trap expert. It became clear that these adventurers weren't here for a serious mission. They were likely just farming materials from the dungeon's upper layers, avoiding the more dangerous depths. Still, even a casual group could become a problem if they realized what Rusty truly was. He remained alert, carefully gauging their movements while picking up the bones on the ground. Be careful, Rusty. There are no laws in these dungeons, and people go missing all the time. Never trust anyone when they outnumber you, and especially those of the many races. Aberdan warned, his voice firm in Rusty's mind. As the group drew nearer, he remained silent, unable to speak without Albert's body inside the armor. He straightened himself out, his frame being wider and taller than most regular human men. In his left hand, he gripped a sturdy kite shield, while his right hand held a long sword. The stance was unmistakable and ready for combat. The approaching adventurers instantly recognized the posture and tried to diffuse the tension. "Friend, we're just passing through. No need to worry." One of the men spoke, his voice calm but cautious. "Don't trust them, Rusty." Aberdan's voice rang out again. "Look at their hands. Those 2 fighters are ready to draw their swords. Be prepared for anything." Rusty's eyes quickly scanned their movements. The archer's posture was relaxed, but the 2 armored men had subtly shifted, their hands resting too close to their weapons. Aberdan's warnings were precise and constant, much different from Alexander's. The Demon King was ever watchful, always pointing out threats to Rusty's life or how people might deceive him, and ready to strike when he was distracted. Nevertheless, Rusty wasn't looking for trouble, at least not yet. This dungeon was different from the other he had explored. It lacked the irregular corridors and small crevices where he could hide or stow his helmet in a hole to disappear from sight. If he began openly attacking people here, the chances of being discovered were far too high. His new Detect Life skill was already alerting him to a presence behind the nearby wall, someone who could potentially hear the battle and come looking for trouble. It was better, for now, to let the adventurers pass while keeping his guard up. Rusty subtly adjusted his stance, giving them enough room to walk by without seeming too confrontational. "These new adventurers are getting ruder every day," one of the men muttered as they passed. "Humph." The other grunted as if to agree. Rusty kept silent, watching them carefully as they moved on. Once they were at a safer distance, their grumbling voices carried back to him, but he stayed focused, alert for any signs of a double back or sudden attack. Letting them pass was the smart move for now, but he remained ready for anything. "Letting them go, are you? They were sizing you up, Rusty. You should have struck first, taken their gear, and disappeared. They could have been loaded with valuables. It's because of that fool Alexander that you are slowly losing your ways of a monster, but don't worry, if you stick with me, we'll get you right back on track." Aberdan scoffed at the decision to let the adventurers pass, but from Rusty's perspective, the risk was too great. He didn't want to be hunted by adventurers again. If he were to take resources from them, he'd do it smartly. Now that he had the life detection skill, targeting smaller parties like this one would be easier, but for now, he wanted to grind the normal way. "Someone's behind this wall. It could have been dangerous." "That wall. Don't worry. Even if they heard you, there's no path leading to this corridor. Next time, just ask." Sure? How about you tell me where those orcs are first?" Rusty felt like Aberdan was pushing him to take on more than was safe. It was true the demon now knew the dungeon's layout, and asking him would have probably eased Rusty's mind. Still, he was trying to get used to this place, and murdering adventurers right away felt like a bad idea. First he needed to find himself a challenge, as these black skeletons weren't much of a money maker. The orcs and their body parts sold for 3 times as much, and he would probably also be able to take their items for restructuring. Soon he was on his way, and with the life detection skill he found himself detecting some movement not far from his location. An area with orcs should be nearby, let us hope it hasn't been cleared out yet. After getting into this dungeon, Rusty realized that it wasn't that easy to earn money. All adventures were competing for limited resources. The dungeon only had a limited amount of monsters and treasures inside. The trio that he passed were probably returning back to the city as night had already drawn close. His biggest advantage over these fleshy people was that he didn't require sleep. Once they were slumbering or having parties, this place would belong to him. Rusty moved swiftly through the winding corridors, led by Aberdan's almost flawless memory of the dungeon's mapped layout. His new detect life skill pulsed gently in the back of his mind, alerting him to the presence of both adventurers and monsters nearby. Eventually he appeared at a clearing, where an encampment of orcs was waiting for him. Classification: Lesser Dungeon Orc EL3. Type: Humanoid. Description: a weaker subspecies of orc, commonly found mostly in dungeons. While lacking the intelligence of more evolved orcs, they are formidable in packs. Just as expected, he found the monster that he was looking for. It was around his height, green and muscular, with jagged tusks protruding from its lower jaw. There were just 2 of them, probably due to the fact that this place had been cleared out by someone else. Rusty could see scratches on the walls and holes in the ground that were in the process of mending themselves. With his skill to detect mana, it was quite obvious how the dungeon was healing itself. Despite their weaker classification as lesser dungeon orcs, Rusty knew they would still pose a challenge if not handled properly. They were E-rank monsters just like him and considered something that shouldn't be handled alone. However, that was by adventurer standards and he was not the average adventurer. With the help of his new skill, he knew that no one was watching and now he could finally return to his original form. That's better. Rusty activated the first loadout that turned him into his original body. Gone was the regular iron shell, replaced by the more grayish-dark twilight metal he had become used to. He instantly felt an increase in mobility, power, and durability. The orcs snorted and muttered in their guttural language, unaware of his presence. This would be his first true test in this dungeon, and it was time to put both his body to the test. Thus he prepared himself to charge forth, but before he could, his guide protested. "Wait, Rusty, what do you think you are doing? Hey! I was just going to defeat them." "Sure, but why would you want to fight them together? There is no logical reason to do so. Listen here, your life is tied to my life, so it's something very precious. Because if you die, then I will fade away into oblivion." Aberdan started ranting and he just listened. It was obvious that the Demon Lord only saw himself as the most important being and wanted to preserve his own existence at all costs. Rusty understood that, but he still found Aberdan's constant scheming irritating. Even so, the advice he gave wasn't always wrong. "So, what do you suggest? Should I just lure them out?" "Precisely, divide and conquer, my dear Rusty. Why face 2 when you can deal with them 1 at a time? Orcs are strong but not particularly smart. We can lure one away and dispatch it quickly. Once it's gone, the other one will be easy prey." Rusty sighed inwardly but agreed. Despite his instincts telling him to charge headlong into battle, it would be smarter to follow Aberdan's plan. He just had been itching for a proper fight, but this was not the time for it. Rusty positioned himself at a bend in the corridor, where the walls provided decent cover. He then picked up 2 small rocks, throwing one in the direction of his target and the other in the opposite direction. The orc grunted in surprise, turning its head to locate the source of the disturbance. Its beady eyes locked onto the small stone that had just bounced off its shoulder, and without hesitation, it let out a low, guttural growl. It barked something incomprehensible to the other orc before trudging forward to investigate the source of the noise. The other orc, on the other hand, followed the sounds of the rocks bouncing down the opposite corridor, its heavy footsteps growing fainter as it distanced itself. Rusty remained perfectly still, watching the first orc approach his hiding spot, oblivious to the trap it was walking into. "Patience, Rusty. Wait until it's just close enough." Aberdan whispered as if incapable of shutting up for even 1 minute. The orc's muscular frame loomed closer, its crude axe dragging along the dungeon floor, sparks flying as metal scraped against stone. Rusty felt the tension building in his metallic limbs, his fingers gripping his weapon as he got ready to strike. Then, just as the orc was about to pass his cover, Rusty exploded into motion. He used the usual tactics, shield bash to the chest and then a follow-up attack with his sword. The orc grunted, stumbling back but quickly regaining its footing, raising its axe high for a retaliatory swing. Rusty, however, was faster. His sword thrust forward, lodging itself into the monster's shoulder and drawing blood. The orc roared in pain as Rusty's sword lodged deep into its shoulder, dark crimson blood splattering across the dungeon floor. Despite its wounds, the creature was relentless, swinging its heavy axe in a wild arc, aiming to cleave Rusty in half. But Rusty, with his enhanced stats from his twilight metal form, easily sidestepped the attack. The axe slammed into the stone wall, lodging itself into it and becoming stuck. Rusty seized the opportunity and lunged forward. His blade glowed red as he targeted the monster's nape. The monster's head flew through the air and the rest of its body slumped forward as it was easily dispatched. One was defeated by another and still remained and was charging right at him. This was a great opportunity to test if his darkness affected the fleshy variants of these monsters just as Aberdan claimed. Dark energy erupted from his body, surging toward the approaching orc. The creature immediately began to tremble, as if struck by poison. The reaction was similar to how humans had reacted earlier, but not as intense. Despite the pain, the orc remained on its feet, pushing forward, relying on brute strength to resist. This is interesting. In a way, he was pleased that his opponent wasn't just another training dummy. Though his goal was to make money, the thrill of battle still burned within him, and these orcs made for fascinating sparring partners. That was fun, but are you sure these will sell for anything? Why would anyone want this? Rusty asked, his confusion apparent in his tone. Don't ask silly questions, Rusty. Aberdan replied, with a somewhat awkward tone. There are some things kids like you shouldn't be thinking about. Just know it was on the board and it's a component for a potion that people use, for various reasons, that you don't need to know. Rusty glanced at the defeated orc lying before him, its body already cut in several places. The tusks fetched a decent price, as did the ears and eyes. Aberdan had also instructed him to remove some of the inner organs, like the liver and heart. Taking the whole body would lower the value of the loot. But there was one part in particular that was the most valuable, a set of dangling orbs between the monster's legs that looked almost comical. Rusty stared at the orc's body, particularly at the orbs Aberdan had mentioned. A strange feeling washed over him, a mix of amusement and disgust. Some of Aberdan's and Alexander's memories still lingered in his mind, stirring up those emotions. Despite the oddity of the situation, it was valuable loot. After a brief stretch and a quick nick with his dagger, he dislodged the orbs, leaving the other protruding appendage behind. Are you sure this is the most valuable part? It's certainly big, but the consistency is strange. Rusty, stop playing with the orc's parts and put them away. Out of my sight, this instant. Aberdan's voice was sharp, clearly appalled by Rusty's casual handling of the squishy organ. To Rusty, still new to the world of monster parts, this was an unfamiliar experience. As living armor, he'd never considered examining trophies after battle. However, the loot was precious and he had defeated 2 orcs already, but afterward, he was made aware of one problem. This feels inefficient. Rusty muttered to himself. He wasn't particularly skilled at harvesting these parts. Back when he was in the small party of 4 adventurers, the thief or one of the archers always handled this task. His job was simply to watch their backs while they worked. They weren't much better at it than he was, but at least he could focus on what he was good at, killing monsters. How much money will I lose if I don't do this? You want to leave the processing of the monster materials to the guild. If you do that, we'll lose about 20 to 30% of the money. I'm not sure if that's the best idea. If Rusty had a face he would be frowning. He didn't like the idea of losing that much money, but taking time to harvest parts also meant fewer creatures to hunt, which cost him coins too. If each unprocessed body lost him 20 or 30%, he'd just have to hunt more to make up for it. Another option was to harvest the parts later, once he was back at the inn. For now, he decided to stuff the other orc's body into his storage space, along with the organs he'd already cut out. I'll just deal with this later, he thought. Then, something strange happened. His inventory system made a distinction between the unprocessed orc corpse and the one he had cut up. It reminded him of how he could store living armor parts and exchange them for bronze ingots. Apparently, the same applied to monster bodies and parts. With just a few well-placed clicks, his inventory system could dismantle the monster bodies he had stored, separating them into valuable components. The lesser dungeon orc remains will be lost during the process of desynthesis. Do you wish to continue? It's called desynthesis. At first, Rusty hesitated, but there was no reason to hold back. Once the process began, the system flawlessly dissected the orc's corpse into all the important parts and even some he had avoided due to time constraints. Every valuable piece was neatly extracted and placed back in his storage in a stack. The rest of the body was consumed in the process, but it didn't matter, the processed organs were what counted. Neat. Rusty thought, cheering at his newfound discovery. This would make hunting and harvesting so much easier. Aberdan, however, was shocked at the system. What is this strange system? How can it do so much? That hero won't explain anything to me either. To Aberdan, the former demon lord, the world's system had always been nothing more than a record-keeping tool, tracking his accomplishments and skills. There was no such thing as a soul forge, and certainly, it didn't automatically perform tasks like processing bodies into valuable parts. Even spatial magic required effort, and most magical items couldn't perfectly disassemble materials into ingots or organs. Where was this process taking place? Was there a hidden pocket dimension where it was processed by some type of being and then generated here? It didn't make any sense to him, someone who had lived for hundreds of years and seen it all. This is going to save so much time, now I can focus more on hunting instead of harvesting, and the process has already started. Rusty thought with excitement as he glanced around the chamber. It was a small encampment of E-rank orcs. According to the guild's information, there should have been up to 10 orcs here, but so far, he'd only encountered 2. The area was a popular target for adventurers and was periodically cleared out. Normally, with adventurers regularly around, the monsters wouldn't respawn right away, allowing the area time to regenerate. But Rusty wasn't human, he was a living armor monster. Unlike other adventurers, he could stay here indefinitely, allowing the creatures to respawn without needing to move on to a different location. It made hunting much easier, as for a few seconds after they materialized, the monsters remained stationary. Even now, Rusty moved silently behind one of the green-skinned creatures as it began to form, materializing right before his eyes. Thanks to his mana sense skill, he could clearly see the process in detail. First, pale mana particles gathered from the ground, swirling and twisting into the rough outline of an orc. The body took shape first, followed by the limbs, and finally the head, complete with tusks and scars that added to its menacing appearance. Rusty watched in fascination as the creature solidified, completely unaware of his presence. The moment the orc finished materializing, Rusty seized the opportunity. With deadly precision, he plunged his blade into the creature's head before it had a chance to react. It gurgled, blood spilling from its mouth along with the iron blade that had pierced through its skull. Rusty quickly yanked the sword out, being careful not to damage the valuable eyes and tusks. The orc collapsed to the ground, its body disintegrating into mana particles as it perished. This will be easy. This cycle would repeat itself. The dungeon was a machine that created monsters endlessly, and Rusty had become part of that machine, exploiting it for his gain. His system's new abilities meant he could hunt with brutal efficiency, maximizing his profit while minimizing risk. The only downside was that the dungeon's regeneration took time, so Rusty would need to remain patient between hunts. Quite a way to gather materials, but we can do better than this, can't we, Rusty? Aberdan's voice broke the silence. Rusty had spent several hours farming the orcs. One appeared every 10 minutes, leaving him with nothing to do for most of the time. Though his new system feature had made the process more efficient, it still wasn't optimal. Killing only 6 or 7 orcs an hour, while safe, wasn't going to cut it for long-term profit. What Aberdan said was true, as it was time to move on and find more lucrative methods of earning money. You're probably right. What do you think I should do? Rusty asked, knowing Aberdan had been scheming for a while and had disclosed parts of the plan previously. Aberdan had already crafted a plan for targeting adventurers, especially while they slept, and now seemed like the perfect time to put it into action. We already learned the best way to deal with adventurers during your little iron rank test. Do you mean, the sleeping mist? Bravo, Rusty! You're learning. Aberdan replied, his tone smug as always. The plan was simple: use sleeping mist traps to put adventurers to sleep, then loot them off all their belongings. In this vast maze dungeon, there were several locations with traps already in place. With Aberdan's keen navigation skills, all Rusty needed to do was move to these locations and wait for adventurers to arrive. Once they did, he could trigger the trap, let the mist do its work, and rob them blind while they slumbered. The plan felt simple yet effective. Adventurers who hunted orc monsters like him could be the real treasure in this dungeon. It didn't take him long to arrive at one of these locations, which differed in several ways from the chamber he had visited with his previous adventuring group. Back then, someone had knocked down the substitute weight, an incident still on his mind, though ultimately irrelevant to a monster like him. This looks like a similar pressure plate trap. Why don't we stick to the method they used? You should be able to trigger it from that corridor, or we could use one of the shadows for cover if you have enough mana to remain hidden. Rusty nodded and glanced toward another passage. A small chest sat on top of the pressure plate, perhaps containing an accessory he could use later. Once the adventurers arrived, he could use his bow to knock it down. The walls were designed to close in once the trap was triggered. Blending with the shadows was also an option, but it was better to use that skill as a backup plan when escaping. Now, all he had to do was wait for someone to show up, and in the meantime, he could pass the time by killing a few wandering monsters. Aberdan had chosen a spot where adventurers were sure to pass through, and they waited. Rusty used his free time to battle skeletons, lizardmen, and a new creature, an oversized, flesh-eating bat. The bat was especially annoying, producing disorienting sound waves while clinging to the ceiling. It would swoop down to attack while he was preoccupied with other monsters and usually flee once he started firing arrows in its direction. Eventually, his life detection skill activated, signaling that his first victims were approaching. "Here they come, Rusty. Stay perfectly still and take aim. Once all of them are inside, shoot the chest." Footsteps echoed in the distance as Rusty focused on the number of people approaching. His life detection skill was proving useful, covering a range of almost 50 meters. He could sense 4 people heading his way, and soon their voices filled the chamber. 3 of them sounded female, with only 1 male among the group. "Hey, you're sticking too close to Richter. Richter just likes me more than you. That's not my fault." "That's not true, I'm his favorite. Isn't that right? Girls, please, calm down. I love you all the same, how could I choose between you? That's a strange conversation." Rusty thought, holding perfectly still with his bow and arrow ready. He could tell that 2 of the females were sticking unusually close to the male, with the third trailing slightly behind. While he was aware of some human courting rituals, having multiple people this close seemed like abnormal behavior to him. Rusty listened intently to the group's banter. Though he found their conversation strange, he quickly dismissed it. It wasn't his concern what these adventurers did in their free time or even during their hunts. His only objective now was to trigger the trap and loot them once the mist had done its work. He could feel the tension of the waiting game, his metallic fingers twitching, ready to release the arrow. The adventurers entered the room, their footsteps echoing against the stone walls. They were probably aware of the pressure plate hidden beneath the chest, but that didn't matter. As long as they stepped into the center of the chamber, his plan would still work. "Lily, go grab the chest." "Why should I? You just want Richter all to yourself, don't you?" The 2 girls began arguing, their attention fixated on Richter. Neither wanted to budge, which made Rusty wonder if they'd even move closer into the chamber. Fortunately, the third woman intervened to settle the matter. "Can you 2 be quiet? The monsters will hear you." "Fine, I'll do it, but I'm sharing the bed instead of you." "Hey, that's not fair. That's cheating." For some reason, their conversation was making Rusty angry. Memories that belonged to Alexander, the late hero, and his life of chastity, stirred with rage as if something about the situation was deeply wrong. He couldn't understand why, but the frustration was there, bubbling beneath the surface. Finally, the third woman stepped forward, and Rusty took aim. Just as she approached the pedestal to place a replacement weight, he released the arrow, knocking the chest down. Who did that? Hey! The 4 adventurers, preoccupied with their flirting, were caught off guard. Before they could react, the walls began closing in, and the sleeping mist rose from the floor. Rusty could barely make out their gasps for air and frantic screams as the trap took hold. "That reminds me of the old days, the succubi never left me alone. Ah, it's hard being popular." Aberdan made a few sly comments while Rusty just waited for the blocked door to open itself up again. As the chamber door slowly slid open, Rusty cautiously stepped forward, peering inside at the now unconscious adventurers. The sleeping mist had done its work perfectly. They lay sprawled on the ground, their weapons and gear scattered about. "Look at them, Rusty. Helpless, vulnerable, and brimming with valuable loot. These adventurers come into dungeons expecting danger from monsters, but they never expect someone like us to be lurking, always so gullible." His guide gloated while Rusty silently observed the scene. 2 of the women lay unconscious, draped over the man, one of them had animal ears, while the other appeared to be fully human. The third, a pointy-eared elf, had collapsed in the middle of an attempted retreat, her body sprawled a short distance from the trio. Now, they were all there, defenseless and vulnerable, with no one capable of stopping his next move. "Hey? Why is it so cold?" A man's voice echoed in the large, open chamber. He clutched his head, trying to ease the pounding headache. His name was Richter, and just moments ago, he had been enjoying a regular trip into the maze dungeon with his 3 companions. It took him a second, but then he remembered, someone had triggered the trap, releasing the sleeping mist. What? His vision, initially blurry, sharpened, and he realized why he was so cold. His expensive armor was gone. Even his silk shirt was missing, leaving him stripped down to his underpants. The same fate had befallen his companions, 3 women, all missing their newly bought adventuring gear, left with nothing but their undergarments. Panic surged through Richter as he scanned the room, realizing the extent of what had happened. His beloved sword, the one he had saved up for months to buy, was gone. The enchanted rings he wore on his fingers were gone. Even his prized potion belt was missing. His heart pounded, his mind racing to comprehend how they had been so thoroughly robbed without waking up. What happened? One of the women, Lily, stirred awake, her fox-like ears twitching as she heard Richter's voice. She, too, quickly realized her missing armor, her face turning pale. Where's all our stuff? The other 2 adventurers, a human named Kara and an elf called Ilara, began to rouse as well. Ilara, usually the calm one, sat up slowly, a deep frown creasing her face. We've been looted? They even took my boots. She glanced around the room, searching for any clues, but the stone chamber was empty aside from their discarded bags, a few torn pieces of clothing, and a small pile of crude weapons. All eyes turned to the pile. The items were crude, worthless, barely fit for use. It seemed that whoever had robbed them had left these behind out of pity. Who did this? Do they expect me to use this rusty sword? Richter staggered to his feet, anger boiling inside him. He sifted through the pile of crude weaponry and pulled out a rusted iron blade. Holding the sword high, his hand trembled with fury. The blade was chipped, dull, and barely held together at the hilt. It was a mockery, a pitiful replacement for the finely crafted weapon he had lost. His heart raced as he glanced back at his companions, all of them sharing the same stunned expression. Whoever did this, they're going to pay. Richter shouted, nearly hurling the rusted sword to the ground in frustration. But with nothing else to arm himself with, it was the only weapon available. They were 4 unarmed adventurers, and even this broken sword was better than bare fists. There's something coming, maybe we shouldn't be shouting. Lily, the fox-eared woman, said, wrapping her arms around herself. Her ears twitched, picking up sounds of movement from one of the corridors. The maze was still teeming with monsters, and it became clear they needed to retreat. Without wasting any more time, the group hastily grabbed whatever crude weapons they could. As soon as they saw a lizardman emerge from the shadows, Richter barked the command. Run, and don't look back. Why did they have to take our boots? This floor is so cold. Don't talk, bite your tongue. Unbeknownst to the group of adventurers, the person who had robbed them wasn't that far away. Rusty stood in the distance in one of the empty corridors, his life detection skill informing him about the adventurers departing. Bah, we should have just killed them. If we kill them, then an investigation by the guild might be launched. Alexander said that the guild won't investigate robberies as much as murders. Aberdan grumbled, not entirely satisfied with Rusty's approach. While robbing adventurers of their gear was effective and avoided the unwanted attention that murder would bring, it still felt inefficient to him. Rusty, however, was pragmatic about the situation. Looting them and letting them go meant they'd likely survive, return to town, and replenish their supplies, making them future targets. I wonder how much this will go for. Rusty was looking at the display of his system with all the icons representing the loot he had gotten. The armor set that the person called Richter had was made from some kind of strange alloy. It wasn't steel but something that condensed mana and also had strange magical words written over it. There were also many accessories, some that he had already equipped to exchange his old ones. Probably not that much. What do you mean? Aberdan interrupted his thoughts as he answered his question. Then he quickly explained himself. Those 4 if they survive will probably report everything to that guild or even the guards. The armor that one human was wearing is quite peculiar, it will get identified the moment you try to sell it to any merchant and that's why I said, you should have just killed them. Are you sure? Of course. Isn't there some way to sell it though? There is but... Aberdan had a point but he also couldn't keep his knowledge hidden away. Rusty already knew how to manage his words around this demon lord who liked to withhold information. The armor set he'd taken from Richter was unusual, and selling it could attract unwanted attention, but there were still ways of getting around that problem. A Thieves' Guild should exist in that city. A Thieves' Guild. The glowing orb of black light hovered closer as Aberdan continued by explaining to Rusty what this guild was. A Thieves' Guild is an underground network of criminals who specialize in smuggling, fencing stolen goods, and performing jobs most people wouldn't dare to touch. They're like the Adventurers' Guild, but for, well, the less savory types. For some reason, Rusty felt like Aberdan had some appreciation for this guild of thieves. It was an organization that lacked proper rules and was less honorable. Perhaps it reminded him of the way demons handled things by force and subterfuge. They operate in the shadows, far away from the eyes of the law. If you want to get rid of that armor without anyone noticing, they'll be your best bet. Rusty considered this. A Thieves' Guild? He'd never dealt with criminals before, or at least, not intentionally. The 3 thugs who had attacked him at the inn might have been members. He wasn't sure what to make of it, but the loot adventurers carried could fetch a high price. They didn't seem to carry much gold on them, likely storing it in the city's banks for safekeeping while they ventured out. He'd heard that one could open an account with just an adventurer's card, making it easy to secure their valuables. How do I find this Thieves' Guild? Aberdan let out a low, sinister chuckle. In every major city, there are certain signs. You'll need to keep an eye out for the subtle clues, symbols scratched into walls, strange patterns in the cobblestones. But the easiest way is through the black market. Find a merchant who deals in questionable goods, and they'll likely be connected. Rusty nodded, mentally storing the information away. He later needed to consult Alexander about further information. He had gone through this city in his past and knew a few things, maybe even where this Thieves' Guild was located. Getting this amount of gear from adventurers was great, but without a place to sell, it would be pointless. Let us continue then, lead me to the next sleeping chamber. If you wish. The 2 vanished into the maze, continuing their quest to find more treasure. Rusty relentlessly fought off various monsters like orcs and lizardmen, while also setting traps for unsuspecting adventurers. Although he didn't need sleep, Aberdan warned him not to overdo it. Rusty was playing the role of an adventurer, and some people might have taken note of his actions. If he stayed inside the maze for too long, it could raise suspicion. Nevertheless, his priority was still to rescue Gleam and then leave this place, so he decided to spend a few more days hunting before returning to the city. The date for the auction could be announced at any moment, and he still needed to check on that. Excuse me. Yes, is there a problem? Eventually Rusty had emerged from within the maze dungeon. He had spent close to 5 days roaming around the first floor, killing monsters and setting off sleep gas to rob the adventurers inside. Once he emerged, he was approached by one of the city guards. You seem to be still in possession of your goods. Have you seen anyone suspicious inside of the dungeon? Suspicious? No, I have not. Just like Aberdan had claimed, there was a downside in letting people live. The place seemed to be in an uproar after multiple people got robbed blind. Rusty replied quickly, his voice hollow and devoid of any nervousness. His metallic body was incapable of sweating, and his experience with adventurers had already grown, so handling such a question was not a problem. Very well. Just be cautious. Whoever's behind these thefts is clever, using traps and tricks to avoid detection. If you hear anything or see anyone acting out of the ordinary, report it to us. They seem to target everything and everyone. We believe they should be in possession of a rather large spatial bag or backpack. The soldier nodded. Ordinary people didn't have access to the kind of massive storage system Rusty had. They couldn't just make things vanish into thin air. Instead, they had to stuff items into bags, and if the opening was smaller than the item's size, it simply wouldn't fit. Rusty, however, had taken everything, even large suits of armor that wouldn't fit into a regular bag of holding. Without carrying anything that resembled such a bag, no one would suspect him as the potential perpetrator, something Aberdan had already explained to him. I have not seen anyone like that. Can I go now? Of course, adventurer. Be on your way, and remember, report anything unusual. I will. The guard gave Rusty a final scrutinizing look before stepping aside, allowing him to pass through the checkpoint. Rusty walked while glancing around and saw a few complaining adventurers, some of his most recent victims. All of their belongings were inside of the system inventory, and selling them back to the merchants would probably be unwise. It was better to first sell all the monster parts he had amassed and then search for that Thieves' Guild Aberdan spoke about. We wouldn't be in this mess if you'd taken me instead, Rusty. I don't think there is a mess. I still hunted a lot of monsters, Just look at all those parts. The moment Rusty left the dungeon, he replaced his demonic guide for the hero. Alexander gave him an earful about robbing the adventurers blind, but he couldn't deny the facts that he had earned more through this. Some of the adventurers even had monster parts which he could now sell to the guild for profit. You need to get that bag ready, don't even try using your special storage in the guild or when other people are looking. I've been trying to, but there were a lot. Once he arrived in the city, the first thing he did was slip into a secluded alleyway. There, he retrieved one of his looted items, a much larger bag of holding. After ensuring no one was watching, he began depositing the decent-sized monster parts he had collected. A small dark hole appeared in the air as claws, eyeballs, and hearts tumbled into the bag. Opening his storage to transfer everything was draining, as it consumed a significant amount of SP. During his dungeon hunts, he had to keep some SP in reserve to swap out his loadout, but now he was free to use up everything. That's all of them. See, I told you that it was fine. We will see, I just hope they won't make a fuss. Alexander seemed unsettled by something, but Rusty didn't have time to worry about it. Nearly 5 days had passed, marking almost a week since he arrived in this strange city. Gleam's auction was set to take place in a week or maybe 2, leaving him with little time to gather more money. Although he had earned a lot from the dungeon, he still needed more. After filling his bag to the brim, Rusty headed to the Adventurers Guild. This time, he didn't need any guidance, he simply got in line and waited for his turn. Just like before, the guild worker pressed something to open a spatial box. That was his cue to take out his bag and hold it steady. Once he was in position, a small flood of monster parts began pouring out, drawing the attention of a few onlookers. Normally, processing monsters took time, so most adventurers just hacked off limbs to maximize what they could fit into their bags. But thanks to the system, Rusty was able to perfectly sort everything and even remove the blood, making the process remarkably clean. The guild clerk's eyes opened wide as he saw the torrent of perfectly preserved parts. Soon the magical device responsible for counting the monster parts began whirring, calculating the value of the bounty Rusty had brought in. "Whoa! This is impressive!" the clerk exclaimed, his hands moving quickly to grab the money that Rusty was owed. After witnessing all the well-preserved parts coming out of that bag, he wasn't even surprised by the high reward the magical device indicated. "You've really outdone yourself this time. This batch will net you quite a sum." Rusty felt a swell of pride at the praise but did not reply to the man. Instead, he noticed that some of the adventurers were looking at him in strange ways. He was given a large sack filled with coins that he promptly deposited into his spatial bag. "Remember this well, Rusty, it's not good to show off, at least not until you've made a name for yourself." "I'll keep that in mind." Soon, Rusty left the guild, his earnings having more than doubled. While this pace was promising, he wasn't sure it would be enough to buy Gleam back at the auction. What he needed to do was gain access to the Thieves' Guild and, more importantly, the black market. There, he could sell off the stolen goods he had acquired. However, he had no idea how to find it, his guides had been frustratingly vague in their descriptions, and Alexander wasn't sure of its location either. He was a hero, not a thief, and while he could recognize the mark of the guild, he had no idea where it was situated. "Well, look who it is." Luckily, he had gained some attention and a bit of notoriety. From the distance, a familiar voice called out to him, and they weren't alone. Rusty turned his head toward the voice, his visor locking onto the person who had just spoken. A group of figures emerged from the shadows of a nearby alley. The one who had addressed him was a familiar-looking lanky man with a smirk plastered across his face. He wasn't alone, and he certainly wasn't the leader of the group. In the center stood another figure, bald, a bit below 2 meters in height, with a face covered in tattoos and scars. He was wearing a heavier suit of armor, but his face was exposed. "Thought you'd never see us again, Albert. It's those thugs again, and this time they've brought friends." Alexander whispered to Rusty, who had also recognized the group entering the alley. Rusty had been on his way back from the guild after depositing the monster materials he'd collected. He'd taken a shortcut through the alley to reach the inn where he was staying. It was the middle of the night, and the city gates wouldn't open for a few more hours. These thugs seemed to have been waiting for him, only approaching once he was alone and out of sight of the city watch. "I was wondering who these people were, but they don't seem like much of a threat. Can I kill them all?" Using his life detection skill, Rusty had sensed a few people waiting in the alley ahead. The skill worked in a peculiar way, the stronger the life signal, the more intensely it resonated in his metallic head. With it, he could roughly gauge someone's power level. Even this new, armored individual was no match for him. Compared to the monsters inside the dungeon, this guy was on the level of an E-rank orc at best. Normally I would be against it, but they clearly mean business, their intentions are obvious, they are here to kill you, and this alleyway is probably the perfect place to make people disappear. Alexander assessed the situation for Rusty. It was probably just as he suspected. Rusty didn't respond but stood still, watching as the larger thug stepped forward, his knuckles cracking with a loud pop. The group numbered 5 men in total, 3 in the front and 2 behind him. The moment he was halfway through the alley, the 3 with the lanky man stopped him from the front, while 2 quickly closed off the escape route from the back. That's what I wanted to hear. Rusty was eager to crack some skulls, irritated that these thugs had now harassed him not once, but twice. However, just as the moonlight gleamed off the hairless man's bald head, Alexander suddenly stopped him. Wait, Rusty. Don't kill that baldy. Oh. Why not? Those tattoos he's got, one of them belongs to the Thieves Guild. He might be our way in. Rusty's visor flickered as he heard Alexander's words. The bald man, covered in tattoos and scars, wasn't just some common thug, it seemed he had ties to the very organization Rusty had been searching for. The Thieves Guild. He still had all the stolen goods from the adventures stashed away in his system inventory. Perhaps this bald man was a key to getting him inside the black market. Ha, those idiots! Before the battle could begin, one of the thugs pulled out a strange scroll. At first, Rusty saw it as a potential threat, but Alexander urged him to let them use it. The scroll began glowing with a white light, and soon the alley was enveloped in a peculiar spell. A silencing spell. No sound will escape this alley. Those idiots just signed their own death sentence. Rusty had studied basic spells in the Soul Forge library and recognized this one immediately. It was commonly used for robberies and murder, perfect for keeping unwanted attention away. In the darkness, with sound completely muffled, no one would know a fight was taking place. This meant Rusty didn't have to worry about keeping up his human guise or avoiding attention. He started by stepping back, wildly swinging his blade around as if in panic, deliberately giving the thugs a false sense of confidence. The thugs grinned, taking the bait. The armored man among them wore heavy gear, equipped with a shield and mace. It was clear they had come prepared for someone in heavy armor after their last failed attempt. Ha, you lost to this coward. Be careful. He's stronger than he looks. The lanky man warned as the bald one closed in. Don't worry. I'll pry him out of that shoddy armor, but remember, all his belongings are mine. The lanky man nodded as the bald one stepped forward, ready to deliver a shield bash. To them, Rusty appeared like a cornered animal, but they hadn't realized they were the prey. The thug charged, moving at a surprising speed, aiming to slam into Rusty's kite shield. But when they collided, the expected outcome didn't happen. Instead of sending Rusty crashing into the wall, he stood firm, unmoving, as if he were made of solid iron. What? Confusion flickered in the thug's eyes as Rusty hadn't even flinched. Then, something began to change. His metallic form, which had appeared to be ordinary armor, shimmered and shifted, transforming before their eyes. His armor switched to the all-rounder form, something his enemies didn't expect. Before the thugs could react, a dark fog spilled across the ground, engulfing the already shadowy alley in pitch-black darkness. What is this? I can't see anything. One of the thugs yelled, panic creeping into his voice. Ack, is this poison? The black mist was taking effect. Everyone caught in it felt weak, their bodies growing heavy and dizzy. They didn't need to check their statuses to know they were afflicted by some kind of debilitating status effect. But by the time they realized it, it was already too late. The alley was now drenched in darkness, a thick fog that disoriented the thugs. They coughed and staggered, trying to find their footing in the growing sense of panic. Their silencing spell had done them no favors and now they were blind and defenseless. Rusty's metallic form moved within the mist, his footsteps loud but unable to echo out into the city. The bald leader swung wildly, his mace slashing through the air, but it connected with nothing. He couldn't see Rusty anymore, and his frustration grew as the fog sapped his strength. He cursed under his breath, realizing they had vastly underestimated their target. Suddenly, a blade pierced through the mist, striking the lanky man in the leg. He screamed, dropping to his knees, but the sound was swallowed by the silencing spell with only the people inside of it being able to hear. Rusty emerged from the darkness behind him, his sword glowing red as it sliced through the man's nape, cutting through his jugular instantly. Blood spurted briefly from the lanky man's neck, but his body crumpled silently to the ground. The thugs were still reeling from the poisonous mist, disoriented and powerless, their confidence shattered. The bald man, the leader, was furious. His tattooed face twisted in rage, eyes darting around in a futile attempt to find Rusty in the oppressive darkness. His mace swung again, cutting through but finally colliding with something, one of his allies' faces. The thug screamed in agony as his cheekbone shattered from the force of the blow. His cry was quickly joined by others as the rest of the group suffered devastating injuries. One by one, they fell, their bodies crumpling under Rusty's brutal assault. The dark mist that had enveloped the alley began to thin, gradually lifting to reveal the grim scene beneath it. Shit! Let's talk about this. As the fog cleared, a crushing reality hit the bald man, he was the only one left alive. The 4 other thugs lay on the ground, their arteries severed in vital places, blood soaking the alleyway. It was clear now, Rusty was too strong for them and bartering was probably the only way out. Now hold on there, I'm sure we can work something out. What do you think, Alexander? Rusty stood victorious. The battle seemed over, but the man facing him hadn't fully given up. He still gripped his shield and mace, refusing to capitulate. The darkness that cloaked the alley wouldn't last much longer, and Rusty lacked the mana reserves to maintain it. He wanted entry into the Thieves' Guild, but trusting this man seemed like a mistake. If he tried to infiltrate the guild, he'd likely be attacked again. I wouldn't trust him. He'll stab us in the back the moment we turn away. There's a better way, but first, you need to knock him out. Alexander's plan was clear, knocking the man unconscious was necessary. Rusty stepped forward, his towering metal form looming in the dimly lit alley. The bald man's grip tightened around his mace, but Rusty could see the fear creeping into his eyes. The mist was clearing, and with it, the last of the man's confidence. Let's talk. Rusty didn't respond. Albert's remains were not inside this form. Instead, he launched forward, mimicking the shield bash the man had used against him. His opponent tried to brace himself, but was knocked back. As the man staggered, gasping for breath, Rusty swapped his sword for a mace. A few exchanges later, his opponent's head met the blunt force of twilight metal, and he crumpled to the ground. Like this. Think you went overboard, his head's bleeding. Better use one of those potions you grabbed from the other adventurers, or he won't make it. The man was unconscious, his HP slowly dropping. He wouldn't last long. Rusty quickly searched through his stash tab, pulled out a potion, and poured it over the man's head. The wound began healing rapidly, his life saved at least for now. Okay, he's out cold. Now what? Rusty was still unsure what to do with the thugs. Alexander usually wasn't one for sneaky tactics, often advising him to leave people alone. However, he seemed to hold a particular disdain for thugs like this one, seeing them as little more than monsters rather than people. If I'm not mistaken, now that he's knocked out, you should be able to use your possession skill on him. But since he isn't dead, it might not work as well as it did with Albert's remains. Oh, now I get it. After the explanation, Rusty understood the plan Alexander had in mind. You want me to use his identity as a member of the Thieves' Guild, don't you? Yes, but that's not all. This guy should be a true member, which means he should be able to register you as one. Alexander began explaining how the Thieves' Guild worked, or at least how it did in the guilds he'd encountered when he was alive. It was similar to the Adventurers' Guild, but harder to infiltrate. Thieves hid behind passwords and concealed locations. To register a new member, someone already in the guild had to vouch for them. So, you want me to possess this person, access his memories to get inside the guild, and then have him vouch for me as a new member. Exactly, that's the plan. But won't they get suspicious if after he registers me, he vanishes? It should be fine, these people operate differently than the Adventurers' Guild. If one thief vanishes they will just assume he was killed by some old enemy and not by someone that he registered. I see, this Thieves' Guild sounds less honorable than the other one. I bet a Burden would agree with this. I bet he would. Alexander replied, though his tone was far less enthusiastic. Still, as Rusty's guide, he was obligated to help, whether he liked it or not. These thieves and thugs were villains with many enemies. At any moment, an old friend or family member of one of their victims could seek revenge, and that was something everyone in their guild was keenly aware of. His possession skill had leveled up as he had been using it constantly. It worked well on a dead and mummified body, but he had never attempted to seize control over a living person. The man was wearing heavy armor already, so he just needed to cover his face with his helmet and give it a try. Rusty crouched over the unconscious thug, his metallic fingers curling around his helmet as he prepared to remove it. The man beneath him was still alive, so Rusty wasn't entirely sure how his possession skill would be affected. He placed the helmet over the man's head and activated the ability. Here we go, this feels different than before. There was a slight resistance at first. Unlike the dead, whose bodies offered no protest, the living had a mind of their own, a flickering remnant of self-preservation. The man's mind fought back, but in his weakened state, Rusty's willpower overwhelmed him. Rusty's vision dimmed briefly, and then he felt a jolt as if he'd been pulled into a different body. Suddenly, he wasn't looking at the world from his metallic frame anymore. He was seeing through the thug's eyes, feeling the weight of his armor, the dull ache in his muscles, and the dizzying sensation of pain lingering from their short brawl. It took him a moment to adjust. His control over the man's body wasn't perfect, like walking in shoes that didn't quite fit. But it would do for now. Is this what humans feel? It wasn't like this with Albert. Previously, the body he possessed had been long dead, unable to move on its own, requiring Rusty's metallic shell to function. But this was different. This man's body was fully alive, capable of standing on its own. Rusty's true form stood nearby, helmetless. The thug now wore Rusty's helmet, his face hidden beneath it. From the outside, he looked like any ordinary person, convincing enough to get Rusty into the Thieves' Guild. Rusty flexed the man's fingers, testing the limits. His movements were sluggish, but the thug's body responded. He stood up on shaky legs, dusting off the armor. He could feel the dull throb in his skull where Rusty had bashed him, but the healing potion had worked wonders. That's it. Looks like you've got control, now use his memories to pinpoint the location of the guild and their password. Alexander's voice echoed in Rusty's mind as he was stuck with him even if he discarded his main body. Rusty took a moment to tap into the thug's memories, sifting through the murky haze of pain and confusion clouding the man's mind. It wasn't as easy as he thought it would be. Unlike Albert's remains, this body still had an active consciousness, albeit dulled from the fight and the potion. Come on, show me. There, that should be it. Rusty muttered under his breath as he concentrated. Slowly, fragmented memories began to surface. Images of back alleys, secret handshakes, and dimly lit taverns flickered in his mind like pieces of a puzzle. He saw a symbol, a strange black coin, and recognized it as the sigil of the Thieves' Guild. Now that the truth was out, he just needed to go there and register himself as a new member. A knock echoed through the narrow alleyway. The man wearing dirty, torn clothes stood before a thick iron door, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light of a nearby lamp. The rat scurried away, startled by the unexpected sound. The man seemed angered by the lack of response, but eventually, he heard some movement on the other side. Soon a latch was opened and a pair of eyes appeared through the door's peephole. What do you want? Let me in. The badly dressed man took out a handful of something and dangled it in front of the slit the man on the other side was peeking through. It looked like some cheap jewelry, something that had been stolen recently. The man on the other side just snorted without opening the door. What's the password? Password? Yet. Was it? Antwerp. Sure it is, wait for a moment there, I'll let you right in. The man that looked like a beggar smiled, his yellow teeth showing as he heard more movement on the other side. It sounded like multiple latches were being drawn back from behind the door. The heavy iron door creaked open, revealing a narrow, poorly lit passage that led further into the building. The man who had peered through the peephole stepped aside, giving the dirty-looking figure room to enter. He was a grizzled, burly man with scars lining his face, the kind that said he'd seen his share of brawls. His eyes glimmered with suspicion, but he didn't press further on the password but instead waited for the man to enter. Get in. Sure friend, can I sell it inside? Yeah, just get in. The burly man gripped a club in his left hand, hiding it behind his back. As soon as the other man walked through the door, the club was immediately brought down. The door slammed shut behind him, and the thief's screams were muffled. However, one person was fully aware of what had just transpired. He appeared from around the corner, clad in heavy armor. So that's what happens when you give the wrong password. Alexander remarked to Rusty, who lumbered forward, now possessing the mind of the Thieves' Guild member. Through reading the man's thoughts, Rusty had learned the true password needed to pass through that door. Thanks to the man's memories, he knew the password changed every week. Every guild member had to memorize the passwords for the correct week, and they changed every month. Often, beggars like the unfortunate man he had just seen would pick up an outdated password. When they tried to enter, they were swiftly dealt with. Rusty, now possessing the body of the bald thug, stood near the entrance to the Thieves' Guild. The heavy door ahead, thick iron and layered with scratches from years of use, loomed ominously. The scene that had just unfolded, the beggar being lured in, only to be struck down for using the wrong password, was a brutal reminder of the guild's ruthlessness. Good thing you got the right one. Just don't mess it up, or you'll end up like that guy. That guy didn't look that strong, he can't defeat me. The thieves in the guild are like roaches, they might not stick together like the adventurers, but they will defend the entrance at least. I'll be careful then. Rusty, still adjusting to the unfamiliar sensation of inhabiting a living body, approached the door, his new body heavy and sluggish. The memories of the thug helped guide him, but it wasn't the same as his usual strength or agility in his true form. He was probably weaker than when possessing Albert, and he wasn't sure what would happen if this fleshy body was injured. He had left his main body inside of his system, and if anything went wrong he was ready to activate one of his loadouts. His hand collided with the door as he knocked. He could sense some movement inside, so he just waited. After a few moments, the small slit in the door opened, and once again, a pair of watchful eyes peered out. Unlike before, the eyes seemed sharper this time, with a little blood running through the middle. Again? You better not be with this old guy. What's the password? Rusty hesitated, drawing on the fragmented memories of the thug. He mentally sifted through the jumbled information, making sure he had the right answer. Then, in a gruff voice, he muttered. Swordfish. Come in. The eyes behind the slit narrowed slightly, but after a brief pause, there was the familiar sound of heavy locks being unlatched. The door creaked open just wide enough for Rusty to squeeze through. As he stepped inside, the dim light of the alley was replaced by the flickering glow of oil lamps hanging from the walls. This was not the Thieves' Guild, but just one of the entrances. The building was one of the local taverns. There was an open door leading to a wine cellar, one way going up, and a large sideways placed tun that was almost the height of an adult. It had a large wooden tap in the lower midsection, but for some reason, it didn't look like it had been used in a long time. The beggar he had seen earlier was no longer there, but fresh bloodstains marked the ground. Alexander glanced at the blood splatter and how it trailed towards a large wine barrel. He instantly understood what had happened. The entrance to the guild must be behind that barrel. They must have dragged that poor fool in there after knocking him out. Alexander didn't say anything, unsure of his theory. He had heard rumors of the Thieves' Guild selling people into slavery, and this beggar might face the same fate for trying to enter without being a member. Perhaps the man's future lay in the dark mines, or maybe they would simply throw him back onto the street after roughing him up. I hate this flesh. I can't wait to get back to my true form. What is even that? Rusty muttered to himself, adjusting to a new sensation. Inhabiting a living body was vastly different from possessing Albert's mummified corpse. As a living suit of armor, he had no sense of smell or fatigue, but now, all sorts of rancid odors assaulted his nostrils. The guard who had let him in reeked of body odor, and the entire place had an intense, unpleasant smell. Rusty had never realized humans dealt with this constantly and wished he could leave the body as soon as possible. The path in one direction was noisy, leading toward the tavern. However, he wasn't heading there. Before he could ask for directions, the man he had given the password to walked toward the large barrel. Using the same club he had hit the beggar with, the man struck a hole in the wall. There was an audible click as something socketed into place. A mechanism activated, causing the front cover of the barrel to slide aside, revealing the entrance to the Thieves' Guild. What are you waiting for? Go on in. He nodded silently at the man, offering no reply, then quickly stepped through the opening. His body was slightly above average in size, so he had to squeeze himself through. Once inside, the entrance began to seal itself, leaving him in a small, dimly lit corridor that led to a ladder descending downward. I see, the guild must be in the old sewers. Makes some sense. What the hell is that smell? You better cover your nose, Rusty. This won't be a pleasant journey. Rusty, now just a helmet on the man's head. When he first entered, his visor had been up, allowing the door guard to see his face. Now, as the stench hit him even harder, he had to pull the visor down, hoping it would help him endure the foul odors. He descended the ladder, arriving in a damp, murky space where the water reached his ankles. Each step felt strange, as if he was stepping into something squishy. He used the man's recent memories to guide himself. His goal was to reach the black market, but the journey was proving more difficult than he had anticipated. They use these strange markings to indicate the way to the real entrance. I think it's in that direction. Alexander, who was connected to Rusty as his guide, helped him navigate through these fragmented memories. He identified some carved symbols on the walls as secret codes only guild members could decipher. With their guidance, he continued through the sewers. This place reminded him of the dungeon but without any monsters to fight, instead it was filled with flies and rats. The air in the sewers grew heavier with each step Rusty took, the stench intensifying as he trudged through the murky water. His thoughts were split between navigating the darkened tunnels and the repulsive sensation of his new, fleshy vessel. Every step felt unnatural, and the feeling of squishy debris beneath his boots only added to his discomfort. Why would people willingly go down here? Rusty muttered, and Alexander quickly answered his question. They wouldn't, and neither would any guards or knights be willing, that's why they put the guild here. I see. People adapt to whatever keeps them alive. You'd be surprised what they'll endure. After a few minutes, Rusty finally spotted another marking on the wall, a small, barely visible symbol shaped like an inverted triangle. It was etched into the stone and partially obscured by grime, but the thug's memories recognized it as the final indicator. This was the way to the guild's black market. Rusty's pace quickened, eager to get out of the foul water and closer to his objective. He arrived at what appeared to be a dead end, but he knew better. The man's memories had revealed a way to pass through the wall, similar to the method the door guard had used earlier. To the side, there was a small hole in the wall, just the right size for the black coin he carried. Sliding it into the socket, he heard a familiar click, and the wall began to shift, slowly opening to reveal the path ahead. This must be it. He cheered as he moved deeper. The narrow tunnels began to open into a larger chamber. Flickering torchlight illuminated the walls, casting eerie shadows along the uneven surfaces. The faint sounds of voices and movement became clearer the closer he got. His skill to detect life confirmed everything. He was in a place with a lot of individuals and they were quite busy. This is it. You've made it to the market, so this is how it looked. It's similar to one that I visited on my journey, or at least I think it is. Rusty paused at the edge of the chamber while Alexander tried to recall his past. From here, he could see the layout, a sprawling underground market hidden beneath the city, with various stalls set up along the damp stone floors. Thieves, smugglers, and black market traders bartered openly, selling stolen goods, rare artifacts, and illicit substances. The place was teeming with activity, but the whole operation was cloaked in shadow. The traders wore hoods or masks to conceal their identities, and even the buyers moved with caution, careful not to draw too much attention. Rusty scanned the area, searching for the next step in Alexander's plan. His goal wasn't just to reach the black market but to find someone of high enough rank within the Thieves' Guild to register him for future transactions. There were two reasons for this. First, he planned to return here after raiding the dungeon and robbing more adventurers. Second, he didn't have much time left. His mana was draining rapidly, and he only had a few mana potions to sustain the possession. Though the potions worked like mana crystals, they were far less efficient. If this place operated like the markets above ground, he wouldn't have time to haggle, so he needed to hurry. This is the black market, but they should also register newbies here. If this guy's memories are correct, you just need to pay half a gold coin to register first and then another half of it in stolen goods to be accepted. That's a lot. See it as an investment for the future, Rusty. Sometimes it's better to look at the future rewards. Investment. People use strange words. Rusty glanced at his MP indicator, realizing he needed to act fast. He quickly scanned the area, searching for something resembling a reception desk. The Thieves' Guild was nothing like the Adventurers' Guild. Here, no one would offer assistance. Instead, everyone remained on guard, eyeing each other warily. Bloodstains on the walls and floor served as grim reminders of the frequent fights that broke out between guild members. The first part of the guild he entered was the black market. It wasn't just for guild members, sanctioned merchants were also welcome here. These merchants were more valuable than the lower-ranking thieves, as they brought in large sums of money. They specialized in purchasing stolen goods and sometimes even people. Later, they'd smuggle these goods out of the city, reselling them in places that appeared respectable and clean. If something was too volatile they would even take them to other countries or present them on auctions where the profits were usually higher. The second part was further away, from the bustling market, where guild members congregated to discuss operations and coordinate their illicit activities. It was also where the guild kept its most valuable secrets, including the identity of the highest-ranking members and the locations of its hidden stashes. If Rusty wanted to be fully integrated into the thieves' network, he would need to make his way there eventually. But first, he had to ensure his registration into the black market so he could freely trade stolen goods and gain access to the guild's resources. His destination was a third area, somewhat resembling the Adventurers Guild above. It featured a small, shabby bulletin board filled with requests for stolen goods, some even providing maps to the buildings the thieves were tasked with robbing. This area was farther from the black market and had the appearance of a rundown bar. Behind the counter stood another burly man, similar to a guild receptionist. This was the person he needed to speak with. Rusty approached, keeping his face neutral under the helmet, though he could feel the strain of maintaining control over the fleshy body. His mana reserves were dwindling faster than anticipated. When he reached the counter he placed 5 silver coins down and slid them across the counter without a word. The man glanced at the 5 coins before him and just grinned. Registering a newbie? You know the rules, if they can't get the merchandise here in a week, you'll get punished. Rusty nodded, he somewhat knew the rules and once this was over, he needed to quickly get back into his old body before his possession skill wavered and it probably wouldn't last for more than a few minutes now.